Hey everyone, and welcome to this video covering invoicing in Dynamics 365 Project Service Automation. So now that we've kind of gone through the sales process from qualifying our lead to all the way to submitting our time entries and having them approved, it's time to actually invoice the hours and expenses that we've done towards our project. So let's hop in the system and see how invoicing in project service automation actually works. So I'm here on my project contract. And again, the project contract is a place that kind of ties all those financial aspects together. So if we check the details of this project contract, we can see that we have two contract lines. We have a fixed price line as well as a time and material line. So we're invoicing both fixed price fees as well as time and material based times as well as expenses. So what I have here is a couple of submitted time entries that are pending approval. So let's approve these two time entries that we have right here. And now that they're approved, we can actually go and invoice these hours. Now, to see the actuals that we just approved, we can navigate to related records and then to actuals. Now, as you can see, we have those approved hours here under our actual associated view. So we have a cost and we have unbilled sales. And for the other time entry, we have a cost and unbilled sales as well. So now what we're going to do next is actually invoice these hours. And we have two options for invoicing. We can either create an invoice manually by clicking on Create Invoice on the ribbon. Now, what's really important to remember is that when we click on Create Invoice, all the approved time entries as well as approved expenses will be pulled on the invoice. So for example, if you have approved hours from, let's say, December and approved hours from January, and you click on Create Invoice, that invoice will have all the hours that are approved from December as well as from January. Now, if the case is that you only want to invoice approved hours from, let's say, from the month of December, then you need to use what are called batch jobs. And I've actually covered batch jobs in a blog post that I've written, but I think it's a good idea to cover invoicing by using batch jobs on this video as well. So let's investigate the time and material line that has been created. So as you can see, we have an invoice frequency set as well as a billing start date. And when we scroll down, we can see that we have invoice schedules. Now we have an invoice run date for the 12th of January with a transaction cutoff date for January 1st. This means that when I'm invoicing today, today's the 12th, when I'm invoicing today, all those approved time entries and expense entries that are for expenses and times for the date of the 31st of December will be pulled on the invoice. So the transaction cutoff date means that when we do batch job invoicing, all those entries that are transaction cutoff date -1 will be on the invoice. All right, so let's see how batch job invoicing actually works. Or you know what, let's check out the fixed price line as well, because that will also have an effect on our invoicing. So for our fixed price line, We also have an invoice frequency set as well as a billing start date. And we have our invoice schedule set for the 12th of January. Now the invoice status is not ready for invoicing. So what we need to do is we need to open up the schedule and click on Ready for Invoicing and save the record. So what I have in the system, those hours that I just approved under project approval, they have time entries for both for the month of December as well as for the month of January. Now what I want to do with batch jobs is I want to invoice the hours from December and then manually invoice the hours for January. So let's click on batch jobs and then run workflow. Now what's important to remember here is the name of the batch job has to be create invoices. It can't be anything different. So it has to be exactly that. So let's click on run workflow and choose process runner. And let's click on OK. All right, so we have an invoice here. So let's open that up and let's check what it contains. All right, so we have our fixed price line here, as well as our time and material line here, just as we should. And now that we kind of dig deeper to the invoice, we can see that the start date was the 28th of December. So we have those hours for the month of December here on this invoice. So the invoice looks really good. So what we can do now is we can confirm it. All right, so we have a confirmed invoice and we can just close out of here. All right, so let's come back to the project contract. So now what we have left is the hours for January. And what we're going to do now is we're going to manually create an invoice from the ribbon. And let's take a look at those hours in detail. And as we can see, we have the hours for the 12th of January 2018. So we have January's hours here. All right, so now comes the details, the detailed part about the invoice itself. So now if we're not confirming this invoice just yet, we want to check and kind of edit some details that we have here. So let me actually just close out of here and let's come back to the main forum. All right, so what can we do about the invoice now that it's been created? Before we confirm this, let's say that we want to edit some details for this time and material line. So let's click on that line to open it up. And as we can see, there's not a whole lot to do right here. All the fields are locked. But we can dig deeper and click on the line details, the invoice line details. And by accessing those, we can see that we have some options. We can edit the description as well as the external description. We can change the quantity of the hours. Now, submitted hours and approved hours were 2, so we can increase this to 1 or 3, for example. We can adjust the price and we can change the billing type. We have non-chargeable, chargeable, complimentary, and not available. The non-chargeable and the complimentary are pretty much alike. They're separated. If we click out of the line details to the invoice line, we can see that it says chargeable transactions and complimentary and non-chargeable. So if we choose either of those, then this invoice line detail from here will switch over to complimentary or non-chargeable. So, if for some point at invoice you need to do some adjustments, then you can do those adjustments at this point. So now that we actually confirm the invoice, we'll get some actuals, some billed sales actuals. So let's confirm this invoice as well. And let's leave it at that. And then let's come back to the project contract. And let's go to related records and actuals. And here we can see all that financial data that has been formed from our approved time entries as well as from our confirmed invoices. So we have our transaction type of cost and unbilled sales and billed sales for our time entries. And for our fixed fee, we have our transaction type of billed sales for transaction class of milestone. So the actuals is a good place to check that everything that's going on with your project contract is as it should. Now, we're not diving too deep to actuals, but it's worth mentioning that when you approve your time entries, a cost will be generated and an unbilled sales actual will be generated as well. Now, as you can see, there is a -1 and a -110 here. So what happens is, now that we've gone through invoicing, what we have is a cost actual and a billed sales actual. And these two unbilled sales are actually, they equal 0. So the negative unbilled sales cancels out the other unbilled sales. So this is the logic in which PSA operates when you do invoicing. All right, so let's get back on the invoice and see what happens when we have to credit an invoice that we've previously invoiced. So here under the invoice entity, we have a status reason to bill for both our invoices. So let's click on this one. We have the time and material lines and the fixed price lines here. So now that if we for some reason realize that this invoice is not correct, we can press on correct this invoice. So what happens is a credit note for -240 is created. And now if we close out of this invoice, and we refresh this grid, we can see that the original invoice has been canceled. Now, what if we accidentally pressed on correct this invoice? Well, not a problem. Let's go back to that order, to that project contract, And let's see what happens when we click on Create Invoice again. So now we're manually making an invoice. It creates an invoice for a value of 0. All right. So now let's see what our invoices look like on our list. Oh, went too far there. All right. So we have an invoice for 120 that's billed, for 240 that's billed, and then for negative 240 as well as for 0. So now if we open up this invoice that's for 240, and we confirm this, and we come back to this invoice that we just created, that was created for 0, and we click on Refresh Invoice Line Transactions, we can see that 240 is pulled on the invoice. Now I have to admit that my original point here was, after correcting that invoice, was to go back to the project contract, manually create an invoice for this amount, but I actually forgot to confirm the invoice that the credit note invoice for minus 240, and that's why an invoice for 0 was created. Now what I did was I went back to that credit note and I clicked on confirm, and then that invoice that had a value of 0, I just refreshed the invoice line transactions, so it pulled the hours back. So in other words, when you credit an invoice, the hours that kind of get credited, they don't magically disappear. The next time you're creating an invoice, those hours that were credited, they will be pulled on the new invoice that you're creating. So that's really something where you have to be very careful that you don't forget about those forget about those hours that were credited. So kind of in essence, what I'm trying to say is, use the function of making credit notes, of crediting the invoice. Use it with extreme caution, because otherwise you might run into a situation where you just kind of get an extra figure on the invoice, and then you have a hard time trying to figure out where those financial figures are coming from. So now if we go back to our project contract and we review our actuals again, so let's click on contract from here, and then actuals, we can see that we have a lot of data here. So for example, here we have billed sales with an adjustment status ID of adjusted. And then we have unbilled sales. We have billed sales with adjustment status of unadjustable. which is a minus. So the actuals gather a lot of data based on what you do with the invoices. So I hope this short video kind of gives you an idea about invoicing in project service automation. And again, you can create invoices either manually or through batch jobs. And whenever you run into a situation that you want to make a credit note, I really suggest that you think twice. And I think maybe a good, kind of a good strategy about invoices could be that when you have the invoice all set up, that you kind of make internal rules about when to actually confirm the invoice, because when you click on confirm, you can't edit these lines anymore. So kind of use the correct this invoice as well as the confirm invoice function with a little bit of thought, and consider your financial processes, and especially if you're doing integrations to ERPs like AX or operations, be really mindful about how you create invoices in project service automation. All right, thanks for your time, and I wish you had a good time learning new stuff about invoices, and have a good one.